we had last finished up with talking about Alexander Campbell, and you know, yes, it's certainly possible to overstate the influence of Alexander Campbell in the Restoration movement, but I don't know that you can do that by much. You know, you've seen in the article we read from Hughes in the American Origins book, and you'll see in Reviving the Ancient Faith, if you haven't gotten into that already, you know, Hughes wanting to say that, especially for the Churches of Christ, Stone was much more influential in that time period of identity formation and development, and thinking about how the Churches of Christ are different from, let's say, the disciples or even the independent Christian churches. And so he wants to argue, and I think he does quite persuasively, that Barton Stone was much more important for some early things. But it's really Campbell that gives a lot of shape to the Restoration movement. He lives 20 years longer than Stone does. Stone dies in 1844. Campbell dies in 1866. So there's that additional 2 decades of influence that Campbell has. And really, Campbell was always more prominent than Stone in many respects. And more people looked to Campbell, inside and outside the movement, to understand what you know, the Restoration movement was all about. And so, you know, there's a way in which Campbell's influence is very, very, very important. On the other hand, you know, there is the slightest bit of danger of overstating his importance in his identity as Alexander Campbell. I think that what we're seeing in current Restoration movement developments, some of which will be highlighted in some of the books that we'll read later on in this semester, is this iconoclasm against Alexander Campbell. You know, the attempt by later Restoration movement thinkers, especially among certain groups within the Churches of Christ, to kind of almost deny the impact that Campbell has had on their way of thinking, how they go about interpreting the Bible. There is within certain segments of the movement an almost willful ignorance about how influential Campbell and Campbell's thinking has been. Part of that is from the emphasis from even Campbell's time period of that great criticism of elites, especially in religion, as you've seen in Harrell, you know, and other places. I think Holyfield talks about this as well. You know, Campbell quite extensively, especially in those early years, was very antagonistic to religious classes of clergy, especially those that relied on education, relied on their position in society, or at least as he saw it, and then that for him kind of kept the common people from the Bible themselves. But as you've already kind of begun seeing, when people disagreed with Campbell, when they read the Bible for themselves and disagreed with Campbell, Campbell was very quick to jump in, and sometimes very aggressively jump in, and to kind of try and put his the weight of his authority, in a sense, to try and you know, eliminate any sort of, I don't want to say dissension, but substantial disagreement about certain certain beliefs. So, for example, John Thomas starting to believe in universalism. Very aggressive against Sidney Rigdon, who will eventually join the Mormons. There's a lot of places that Campbell looks or sees certain aspects of theology, and Harold talks about this some as an example of I forget exactly how he refers to it, but the kind of weeding out of the extremes or the fringe elements. That some of those that were maybe more radical about Christian associations and communities, utopian societies, those kind of things, that Campbell and others were very effective at kind of removing those influences from the mainstream disciples movement. And so, there's still that way in which Campbell, even though he's very anti-authoritarian, is also becoming an authority later in his life as well. And I think that that's reflected in one of the hot button topics toward the last couple decades of his life, of the origins of the American Christian Missionary Society. We kind of finished up with this, is that with Campbell's early works, Christian Baptist, he was very adamant against missionary societies, moral societies, any sort of organization that attempted to make decisions for the church at large, wanting to emphasize congregational autonomy. Go ahead, Steve.
This anti-authoritarian and elitism stance early on changes. We talk about the early Alexander Campbell, the later Alexander Campbell. Is this part of what's being discussed there, that he's actually kind of changed his stance, or is he still is has the stance of being anti-elitist, but is functioning as a necessary authority in the denomination?
Yeah, this early Campbell and later Campbell division, I think there is some accuracy to that, and the Missionary Society is a good example of this. He's so against it in his early life, and then so for it in his later life, and I think that there is a change in his views on authority, and I think that part of that is maybe a lack of self-awareness of what he's become. That he hasn't wanted to become the same type of leader that he used to rail against, and even in his later life continued to rail against. And I think part of that is the difference with the structure of the disciples. That as it's becoming a full-fledged denomination, let's say, there's still a lot of autonomy, and people, wanting to not become a denomination. They're wanting to have some connections, right? There is that notion of unity, but they don't want an Alexander Campbell as a pope, or as somebody like that, an authoritarian figure who stands and makes pronouncements for the church. And probably Campbell himself wouldn't have wanted that as well, but he's essentially starting to act like that toward the end of his life, and people, people start to look at him as a source of authority to be followed. And when you think about, and I think that Harold points this out, Campbell dies very wealthy. He had a school that he started that many preachers in the movement graduated from, and so he's become whether he intended or not, he's become a very influential person, perhaps even more influential than he intended. Any other questions? Go ahead, Mike.
I've been reading also a book by a guy named Michael Hines, who wrote a history of the Restoration Movement. He was one of my professors years ago in church history and Restoration Movement history. His book is more, I want to say it's not as objective in the sense that he really does insert more of his own personal opinion about what he believes about things. But one of his frustrations has been the number of people, or maybe I should say prominent ministers in the Christian churches that have left over the decades and gone to different denominations. And I have sensed in his book, and I've never talked to him about it, that today, and I think even so in Alexander and all of their times, there's this wrestling with, we don't want denominationalism, but we want a lot of the benefits from denominationalism. And I think that this is one of the, and to be honest with you, I'm just kind of discovering this, years later, since I've had Michael Hines for a teacher, but this is something that just, it kind of astounds me that there's so much criticism from individuals that are not a part of a denomination that are heaped on other churches and other people for the lack of uniformity and doctrine among the Christian churches. And yet, that would be one of the benefits if we were a denomination. We'd have this uniformity in doctrine, I think, and yet they don't really seem to talk about that as a particular issue. And I didn't know if that's true in the churches of Christ today or not.
Yeah, I mean, and this will come out in Hughes as you read that. There is that same kind of struggle between wanting true congregational autonomy in the sense of there isn't a denominational structure or even a loose denominational structure where there are regional boards and a national board or anything like that, right? There isn't that hierarchy that you see in other groups. But on the other hand, there are quite a bit of people in certain parts of churches of Christ that are very adamant about uniformity of doctrine. And there are even some people on the very traditionalist end who have kind of almost established themselves as watchdogs of the movement, where if there's anybody that's writing a book or becomes famous, but it varies from what these rather conservative individuals believe the teaching of Scripture is, they're very active in pointing that out and pointing out what they believe to be heresy. Which, of course, if we have true congregational autonomy, how do you expect to try and encourage a congregation to fall in line, so to speak, when there really isn't any sort of method to do that if you are truly not a denomination? Go ahead, Jeff. Jeff, I thought you were.
Yeah, I was. I
had
fallen out for a minute, but I was saying one of the positions that seems to be untenable in the Restoration Movement is this idea that you can have unity at the same time not have any sense of connection between personalities. I believe that throughout the history, what's evident is there have always been sectional leaders among churches of Christ who had ties with one another, and although it's not a de jure kind of setup, a de facto reality is that the church has been very advanced and successful as long as it maintains some sense of partnership beyond the local congregational level.
Yeah, and Hughes will even talk about what he calls editor bishops, these individuals, many of them those regional leaders that Jeff was talking about, who attempt to bring about uniformity by using periodicals, journals, magazines, to either highlight places or individuals that are kind of diverging from what they see as scriptural teaching. And kind of trying to use the power of the pen to kind of wheel them in. Go ahead, Garrett.
Yeah, I was going back to Michael's comment just a minute ago. I was thinking, I work at a restoration movement in college as well. We are more with the Christian churches, but we get. I used to work in admissions here, and we used to get questions all the time about what denomination are you with, and the kind of default answer that we would go with is, well, we're not denominational, and that confused a lot of people because of the fact that we still abide by a certain governing set of biblical principles that kind of define us as a movement, and a lot of outsiders, a lot of outside people not within this movement have a really difficult time wrapping their mind around an idea of people that adhere to a certain set of doctrines but are still non-denominational. It's a very confusing thing, and it became, eventually I understood, I began to understand, I can see why this is very confusing for people, and going through these books that we're going through, it helps kind of clarify, why that is kind of, these writers, especially Hughes right now in the book we're in, is really pointing out why that's sort of a confusing, there's kind of a contradiction in terms, I guess, to talk about us ourselves in that way.
Yeah, and the other thing that plays into all this is once you try to name who you are, especially if you're thinking in opposition to other groups, which has often been, even back in the times of Campbell and Stone, you're trying to identify yourself as distinct from the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists, right? And you find yourself having to give yourself a name, but you don't want to hold on to that name, and then the confusion of simply calling yourself Christian with all that is okay. Well, what kind of Christian are you? Can always be the kind of backup question after that. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, and our default arguments in Restoration Movement, especially with Churches of Christ, has been that we have no particular creed that everyone is bound to abide by, and we have no official governing body. And because we can say at least those two things, we see ourselves as independent, autonomous congregations. But again, whether with editor bishops, colleges, or even lectureship personalities, that's been some kind of official voice for Churches of Christ over the past 150 or so years.
Yeah, very, very good point. Go ahead, Harold.
Yes, sir. What I've seen or observed is that there's been a personality or identity crisis. They're not sure what they are or how they are to be defined. And what I've seen in the reading I've done so far is that identity crisis that's caused the divisions, not knowing who to follow really, are really saying, well, I'm following this person, but another group said I'm following this person. And even though they're talking about a unity, there's really no unity as far as what they're speaking of. There's unity in each group, but not unity between the groups. And I kind of saw that when I was reading, most of these books.
Yeah, and it's especially today. I mean, in more recent times, there have been attempts to try and find places of unity between Disciples of Christ, independent Christian churches, and Churches of Christ among some people. Some people have tried to bring that unity. But one of the problems is what one group considers a matter of faith, right? This is a scriptural issue. Let's take the use of instrumental music, for example, right? For the churches, for a lot of churches of Christ, traditionally, it has been that the music in worship should be a cappella without use of instruments, and that's not been the case for the two other streams. So, if you're trying to bring unity, right, trying to restore the restoration movement in a sense, there's places like that where there's such a divergence over, is this a matter of doctrine, or is this a matter where a church or a group of churches has some freedom before God, and how do you get to a place where you find that unity when you don't have any sort of structure that can kind of enforce the unity? I mean, it's one thing to kind of have a structure that says, okay, we all are going to worship a cappella, or we're all going to say however our church wants to worship, but we're all going to be united on it, right? Without that, you kind of find yourself in this position of, every person or every church for itself, so to speak, which leads to fracturing rather than unity.